Yeah, absolutely substantially. So at the time, the materials were coming broadly from the libertarian left, and so particularly in France, with the recent memory of the French Indochina War and decolonisation splits in French politics in the late 50s, that comics world was highly oriented to criticising the American war in Vietnam. So substantial works published by Eric Losfeld, the publisher of Barbarella, later in the 60s, critiqued the war using some famous images from press photography, but also satirising American policy. There's a very famous film called Mr. Freedom by William Klein that you could argue is the sort of summit of that material. In the project we're completing, it's also the case that that community were hugely admiring of American comics, and so all of the time there was also tension with their admiration for famous American comics artists, some of who were very pro American policy in Vietnam, and broadly speaking, a generation of American comics artists had been semi-integrated with the American military because of the use of comics in Allied propaganda in World War II and subsequently. So it would have been difficult for that generation to also share the critique of the younger generation.
I don't think that you can, let's say, present comics as an homogeneous field. One of the main, let's say, claims we made in the first book we co-authored on the graphic novel was the distinction between comics as a kind of cultural industry and graphic novels as a kind of different cultural industry. And actually, let's say in the traditional comics world, yes, when you start looking for that kind of, let's say, references, you will find them, but they are not very rarely at surface level. At least not in the beginning of the 1960s. But then there's a movement toward what we call today the graphic novel, and there, as Hugo explained, it's from the very beginning a key field, a key dimension. And then between both, you have something that is still quite unknown, or that has really been forgotten, and that is the field, and it was, let's say, a third cultural industry, the field of what we call in Belgium, those who know more about it than I do, what we call the so-called small formats. And what is a small format? A small format is something, to put it very, let's say, bluntly, it's a kind of pocketbook comic with 2 images per page, something in between, let's say, newspaper comics, magazine comics, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, comics published in album format, in book format. And that, let's say, third way, so to speak, is something that is now almost completely forgotten, but once again, in the larger context of that archival, let's say, revival of a lot of things, we see more or less of that, more or less kind of return of that material, which was explicitly addressing an adult audience, meaning that that kind of, let's say, small format comics was 50% was a kind of more or less soft pornography. You had a lot of horror, typically genre comics, but genre comics definitely not for children, while serious graphic novels were a kind of, let's say, comics production that wanted to stay away from the traditional genre boundaries. And in that small, let's say, small format publication circuit, yes, sexism and militarism and violence were extremely present, but very uncritically, very uncritically. So it's time there as well to launch a project on the critical, both scholarly and artistic reappropriation of that material. And other people in Belgium are currently doing it. You know what epoxy is? Epoxy is a kind of anthology of, let's say, a famous sexist panel of that period, which has been illegally plagiarized and copied and transformed, mainly in Italian soft porn material. And so you see the same image redrawn by Italian artists in 20, 30, 40 different magazines or publications, but in a very uncritical way. It's the, let's say the bad side of the Barbarella hype. Yeah. And it's called Epoxy. You can still buy it if you. It's an important historical document, not just on sexism, but also on things you hinted at, namely total disrespect of copyright ownership, and now I'm speaking once again as a literary person, in the context of uncreative writing. It's a very interesting document.